All right. So Awkward is back with the Awkward interviews. Most recently, I spoke to Christian Smalls, who we all know now for leading all of the efforts to shut down Amazon. I have another great guest today, Chuck Modiano. He's a writer for Deadspin. He used to work for New York Daily News. He's a journalist like myself, and like myself, figures out a way to kind of intersect journalism with activism, which is something I do want to ask him about, like how, should those two things be separated? And if so, how do you manage to separate them? And, when the journalist becomes part of the story and all of that. I think most people probably outside of the sports arena know Chuck for, being on the streets, it seems, every single day in Washington, D.C. For months now, at the very least since the murder of George Floyd. And I suspect it started well before that, covering Black Lives Matter protests. And, he's also been pretty vocal about the difference in response from the police to the riots or protests or insurrection or whatever you want to call it when it was white right-wing people versus anti-fascists and Black people of color, as well as what people in kind of positions of media power and political power said in advance of that regarding stay off the streets and let the cops do their jobs and things like that. Those who are in sports know Chuck for his, unique take on the intersection of sports and race. He's been very vocal about Colin Kaepernick and, some of the kind of old school, I would say, racists in the sports arena have written about Chuck saying, I don't want to hear this guy's voice because he turns everything into a racial issue. I just want to hear about sports. Those who know me know that I think the way Chuck does, and it's really hard to separate what is clearly a racial issue from, watching Black men do athletic things and bet on them, if it's there. If it's not, I have a feeling Chuck is not looking for it, but that's the way it appears to some. So Chuck, thanks for joining me and ask you about all this kind of stuff. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
Yeah, man, my pleasure. So let's start off with the sports stuff. What do you say to these people who've like gone out of their way to write reviews of your writing? And some of them are pretty old that I've seen, but like, you know, trying to say that there's, for instance, no racial connection to a really talented quarterback like Colin Kaepernick not playing.
I mean, it's absolutely absurd. He's being blackballed, and we have to remember about Colin Kaepernick. He's still being blackballed, and that collusion is a crime. So we're not talking about a difference of opinion. We're talking about a crime that is being committed by NFL owners, and that crime is still being committed as they use Colin Kaepernick's imagery in commercials to promote their alleged wonderful diversity and racial awareness, and have in the end zones words like end racism and Black Lives Matter. So we're talking about an entire lie. And Colin Kaepernick exposes that lie. Not only Colin Kaepernick exposed that lie, Eric Reed, who's also being blackballed, exposes that lie. The unwillingness for these white owners to hire competent, qualified Black coaches, instead hire incompetent, unqualified white coaches who have the benefit of nepotism and are known by other coaches or friends of Sean McVay. These are all truths. So for someone, myself, or so many other sports writers who do the same thing, to point out these truths is just telling the truth. That's what journalism is. It's simply journalism. Because you live in a fantasy and don't see it doesn't make it untrue.
Yeah, well said. And you mentioned things written on the field. The same can be said about the NBA. Clearly they do a lot better than the NFL overall. But performative is performative. They created this opportunity for players in the bubble to wear different slogans on their jerseys, but they didn't even ask the players for input on what those options would be. They have Black Lives Matter on the courts, but there was a lot of hullabaloo about players like LeBron, who actually more so than most do the work, not wanting to wear this shirt because he understood that performative is simply that, and it's not going to change anything. And when the NBA kind of unrolled its plan for addressing police brutality and mass incarceration, or however they wanted to look at it, they were forced to, because after yet another Black man's murder, we erupted into the biggest mass movement in our country's history. They couldn't ignore it. But at the time, I did what I could, which was minimal. I tweeted to the NBA and said, this is wonderful. This is a great performance, but how about fundraising with team owners to raise billions for social justice causes? How about coordinating with the Movement for Black Lives to create PSAs with players who've been impacted by racism and police violence and mass incarceration? And instead of just playing them like, at a convenient time when the game's not going so people can tune out, split screen, play it while the game's going on so people can't ignore it. Interviewing Black female leaders who are doing the work during the games, like Angela Davis, and including people like you or Eton Thomas or others who are focused on this work, bringing you guys in to be announcers or color people. They didn't do any of that stuff. Then on top of it, when the players really made a bold move and went on strike, it didn't last very long because they made the mistake of going to talk to Obama, who is a neoliberal, and told them to end the strike. And they did. I don't blame the players for that. I blame Barack Obama, and I blame the system and all of it. Thoughts on, in general, these like performative kind of gestures, and like what you think sports leagues and players and companies that make tons of money off of these leagues and players can and should be doing instead.
Right. I mean, listen, I don't have a problem with a performative gesture if it is backed up and supported by substantive policy, by substantive action. The problem is when it becomes a substitute for that action. So that's what we saw in the NFL. Like, for instance, go back to the NFL, it is sheer hypocrisy. Any type of racial justice starts with you hiring back Colin Kaepernick, period, end of story. And you could extend that as to the other examples as you're talking about in the NBA and elsewhere. We see this in sports all the time, but we also see it outside of sports. It's a reflection outside of sports. You might have seen yesterday, there were pictures of police cars that have Dr. Martin Luther King on there, Harriet Tubman on these police cars. Well, you're going to forget what Dr. Martin Luther King said about the police brutality and how he spoke against that, and said there couldn't be any freedom until we conquer that. Well, we're going to leave that part out. Okay. When we see Nancy Pelosi in kente cloth, we're saying, what are you doing? Why is your policy not matching this? When more recently, we're talking these discussions of Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. Where is your policy? However you feel about that, a lot of people are divided, but however you feel about that, where is the substantive policies, the racial justice policies? Because you're also an administration who said we're not going to defund police. So how do you say we're not going to defund police? And you can't have it both ways. You can't have a charade. if you're going to do a performative act, and I'm not necessarily against them if they're in solidarity with the action, but it has to be that way. It has to be in solidarity with an actual tangible action to improve people's lives.
Yeah, yeah, well said. I thought of a number. I had not heard about the cop cars. That just blows my mind, man. I mean, it's one thing to see their, you know, ridiculous tweets from like the Department of Justice and, you know, like honoring different Black figures that, you know, obviously if they were still alive would not appreciate their actions, but to put them on the cop cars and
Yeah.
drive around the communities that they're criminalizing, over policing and destroying is really like it's like a slap in the face almost. It's like as bad as performative can get. But you know, it's not that fun to see Nancy Pelosi in kente cloth either. I thought about that one, and I did comment on the Harriet Tubman thing as well. Like, I think it's great. However, it does nothing. You know, like it doesn't. It's nice, but that's all it is. It's nice. It doesn't solve any of these underlying issues. And clearly, it's just a lot easier to perform and do these things than it is to make real change. And I think, you know, it's also easier to make reforms. You know, a lot of, you know, these reforms that are touted on both sides of the aisle when it comes to racial or criminal justice actually strengthen the system itself. You know, everyone was really excited and of course came running to me to ask me how happy I was when Biden signed this thing that he was, you know, going to end private prison contracts at the federal level. Well, I mean, 8% of prisons are private, and you know, people make 8 cents an hour doing slave labor in state prisons. So, and you know, even in that way alone, it doesn't solve the issue. But then there's the fact that by closing private prisons, you're moving all the people who are in them into different prisons. They're not losing any time. Like there's no benefit to people who are incarcerated. So again, it's just another thing that like you can do and it looks really good, but it doesn't at all question the concepts of mass incarceration and putting people in prison and who is being put into prison and why. So as someone who has spent a lot of time interviewing people who are on the streets protesting, you know, what has, first of all, what have you seen in terms of a change, if there has been any, like from, you know, in May when this started to today, in terms of, you know, the messages you're hearing from leaders on the streets, the amount of people, the violence they're faced with, how have things kind of adjusted or, you know, changed over time?
Well, you know, it's been 8 months
Right.
since George Floyd. 8 months, and I'm speaking to DC. I know they're doing incredible resistance in Portland,
Yep.
Seattle, and other places. I'm only speaking to what I know about.
Yep.
And in those 8 months, you have a group of young people who have protested in every possible way and have been met with violence throughout. Their peaceful protests have been met with violence by the police. Food supporters have been met with violence because they were feeding the community. They were feeding homeless people. They were feeding everyone at Black Lives Matter. And what I'm telling you is on video, the violence that happened, them knocking over grills. They were stealing laptops. We call this looting in any other language. And this is what the police did. The police violently took down the tents. The police violently shot rubber bullets and pepper sprayed with almost no provocation, or if one thrown water bottle might have been the provocation. And then you have to juxtapose that to what we saw on January 6th. Okay. And I was there on the lawn. I was standing on a pile of folded up chairs to get a big view. And I'm with a couple of independent media colleagues, and we're looking at each other and we're like, okay, the tear gas is coming now. Okay, the tear gas is coming now. Okay, it's about to come now. And we're saying this to each other because the language people are using is that they stormed the Capitol. That's not actually what happened. They inched towards the Capitol, step by step on the scaffolding. We watched it unfold for an hour before anyone got in there. At any time, they could have unleashed the same tear gas that they did all summer on protesters. They did a little light smoke bomb, but it was like nothing to really move people out of the way, nothing to stop people. We're waiting for the rubber bullet. Where are the rubber bullets at? Because we know I interviewed probably 15 people hit by rubber bullets. A couple went right by me myself. Where were they? Where was that? And we saw none of that. And it all could have been stopped all very easily. My last point that's never mentioned, because they separate Capitol Hill Police and MPD a lot in the news. And while Capitol Hill Police were there, and we know National Guard got a stand down order, we know that now. MPD was out there after 6 p.m. the whole time, post curfew. Well, let me remind folks, the first 4 days post George Floyd, 437 people were arrested, the vast majority on curfew violations. They kettled and rounded up everyone. And why did they do that? They did that so that they could surveil everyone and get everyone's ID and criminalize protesters and maybe go back and look at footage and possibly punish someone if they could match a face with an ID. They had that opportunity on January 6th to kettle 1,000 or 500 or 400 after 6. They did not do that. They chose not to do that. So that dichotomy is incredible.
Yeah. And why do you think that is?
Well, we know now. At the time, I think I tweeted, this is the greatest spectacle of white privilege I've ever seen. And I was wrong. It was even greater than that because it wasn't just incompetence. We know now that at least it was partly an inside job. We know we've seen that. We've seen all the videos of police practically rolling out a red carpet, opening the door, doing everything but giving tea and biscuits, asking, hey, do you need medical attention? As they were inside, you saw the video, as they were inside the, I don't know what to call it, but they were inside, and anyone else would have been arrested, if not shot or killed. And they were saying, do you want some medical attention? That's what the police were saying. So, we have to understand that the police are in the same boat, and that many of them believe Trump lost the election falsely. Right. They were empathetic and sympathetic, and others were simply part of a criminal insurrection enterprise.
Right. So I understand you're a journalist. You're not afraid to speak your mind either. And I believe in that type of journalism. I think the ones who, pretend to be objective and slyly insert, we're all able to write, so we know how to, couch this language in a certain way that manipulates people, but while still being able to call ourselves objective. The journalists that I appreciate either are part of the story because that's the only way to really tell it, or aren't afraid to speak about what they're really experiencing and witnessing. So, it's obviously up to you to what extent you want to go in this direction, but what is the solution in your mind to the, we know that police were created to uphold white supremacy post-slavery. But we also see over the last 20 years, like this mass effort to put as many actual Klansmen and other neo-Nazis into police forces. What do we do when we know that they're actually coming from all over the country to participate in this, whatever you want to call it, insurrection or whatever?
Well, when they come, you have to do what you have always had to do, stand up in greater numbers. And I'm speaking in generally to white people, stand up in greater numbers. When the Nazis came to Charlottesville, and there were a few hundred of them, we came out by the thousands. Okay, we came out by the thousands to shut them down. And what happened over the next year is people were doxxed. People got fired from their jobs. We found school teachers. We found people working in hospitals who have patients, who have students, who they are allegedly supposed to help. And these are Nazis. and we had to got them kicked out of their jobs. And what happened a year later in 2018 in DC, where they had the quote unquote reunite the right rally too? There were like 30 people there, 50 people there, but there were thousands of anti-racists there. We know what the blueprint is. The blueprint is you have to come out. We can't promise safety because we know DeAndre Harris got beaten in Charlottesville to inch his life. We know Heather Heyer lost her life. We can't promise full safety. But what we can't do is say, ooh, it's dangerous out there. We shouldn't show up. Let them run rampant, which is exactly what happened, because they had 2 dress rehearsals in November 14th and December 12th. And they saw what they can get away with. And they tore up the city and they assaulted anti-racists. So a couple of stabbings as well. And they took Black Lives Matter signs and banners everywhere, including churches. Then when they saw they could get away with it in November, and they saw they could get away with it in December, amidst white liberal calls to stand down, well, then you get January 6th. You had 2 dress rehearsals, and white people did not show up according to bad advice, and the police let them have their way. MPD let them have their way. So we all saw it coming in DC. We didn't know the depth of how far it would go or how much it would be an inside job, but we knew they were going to storm the Capitol. They said as much in their message boards.
Yeah, there was no question about it. And so I'm with you 100%. I spent, I don't know, 15 years protesting across the country before I ended up with kids and a wife who won't let me leave the house.
Right.
So, but now I'm trying to do things in other ways. And, to me, as little hope as we may have in our elected officials when we see even the ones that we've that we've made our heroes kind of bow down and vote for Nancy Pelosi, for instance, or not stand up for Medicare for all, or the $2,000 a month, or whatever the things we really need are. I see it as a multi-pronged approach. We need to stay on the streets because we need to keep the fear, honestly. And this is whether there are Nazis on the streets or not. We need to continue protesting for the causes we believe in. But we also need to continue to elect down ballot leftists, because the more there are on this so-called squad, the less they'll feel forced to succumb to pressure. Things like 10 demands that I co-founded early last year, and similar to some localized demands that they had in Seattle that led to the beginning of defunding of the police. Protests are a lot more effective when you have concrete things you're calling for and you demand those meetings. Having said all of that, like, what do you think is the most effective way beyond protest to actually make change, to put the pressure on the people who can change laws and things like that, so that we do not allow another January 6th, for instance?
Right. Well, so let me go back and take a couple steps back for a second to what protest has done, because in DC, it hasn't done a lot. The mayor is increasing the budget. In DC, it hasn't done a lot. But we know in Seattle, they cut the police budget 20% and looking towards cutting it 50%. We know this past week, police budget was cut in Austin, and those monies are being used to help the unhoused. We know that. We know in Colorado, through protests, they became the first state to end qualified immunity, the law that allows police to get away with murder, because all you can say is, I feared for my life. That's all you got to say, and you get off. So the first state, protests did that. Not too much happened in New York, but they canceled an incoming class of over 1,000 police officers. They reversed the direction a little bit from their gargantuan $6 billion budget. And we've seen the nuggets that have come through protests in the last 8 months, which couldn't have been achieved in decades through your more formal means, through your regular council meetings and begging and your petitions and all the nice ways we go about it. So we have to be very clear that these have worked, and we have to keep up that pressure. And when we do keep up that pressure, then we give those who are in the system the leverage and the power to make those changes. And you can't have one without the other. And you can't talk about, I'm actually for both. I have respect for those who are trying to work in the system to make change, because at the end of that change, there's a human life there, right? And we have to work together, but we can't have disrespect that we sometimes have of protesters, like just a bunch of young people running wild. No, they have demands. I've spoken to them. They're very smart. They can tell you what the local police budget is. They can tell you where the resources are going, and they can give you a better analysis that you'll ever see on corporate TV.
Yeah, 100%. As one of those kids, I wasn't just doing it because I was looking to break stuff. We had we spent hours planning every single thing that we did, and then we went out and we did it, I always think about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X too, that without and the Black Panther Party and SDS, without the threat of the so-called, the ones who are willing to arm themselves, Martin Luther King would not have had the success he did in pushing forward the last civil rights movement. And that's how I view those on the streets today, facing tear gas and rubber bullets and kidnappings and arrests and all of these things, risking their actual lives. Because if there wasn't fear that wouldn't turn into something much scarier, they're not going to listen to, like you said, the people begging in meetings and crying and soft pitching, right? So, I definitely hear what you're saying, and it's great to point out the successes that we have had. So, as someone who has been there, to what degree do you consider yourself like a participant versus someone covering it, and how do you distinguish and more from
journalism, the journalist perspective is what you're saying,
that's
right?
the question. Yeah. What is today's independent, who is today's independent journalist, and how do you separate yourself or not? And then do you think that journalists should have special protections that historically they have and Barr tried to get rid of when he was still in power?
Sure, I believe in freedom of the press, absolutely, which generally today is freedom of the corporate press and really doesn't extend to the independent press. Even that has a status assigned to it. I've seen journalists in DC, it's happened to me too, have been beaten on, tear gas, pepper sprayed when they knew they were doing it. They knew they were journalists. They've seen the same 6, 7 people out here with the cameras. They know who we are. So I want to answer your other question, which is really about, well, what's the journalist's role? There's no such thing as objectivity. That's the first part. We have to be very clear on that. Okay. Every journalist in corporate America, to some degree, is a participant in advocating for privilege and power. And what I mean by that is that you will never find an anti-war perspective or panel on MSNBC, on CNN, on any, we know terrible foxes, on any corporate channel. You're not going to see that you actually have to be really pro-war or silent on war to be part of that complex. But we don't say they're advocating war. We don't say you're an advocate for war. When it is standard media practice to be a police stenographer and reprint their statement when we know full well they're professional liars, we don't call them police advocates, right? Only when you voice and amplify the marginalized voices of oppression do they say you're an advocate. Do they say you're biased? Well, I can point out your bias. My job and your job is to find the truth, okay? So I'm very unapologetic in amplifying the voices of those who are most oppressed, because I believe, and others believe before me, that they are the experts in articulating their oppression. And we have to be very clear. There's a long history. This is not new. If you look at the history of the Black press, Frederick Douglass didn't say there are two sides to slavery when he led the North Star. He said slavery was wrong. I'm telling you it's wrong. It's against human rights. I was a slave, and I'm here to teach you and educate you about it. Ida B. Wells did not say there are two sides to lynching. She did not say, let me get the perspective of the lyncher and interview the lyncher. No, she did not do that. She said lynching is wrong. It's a human rights crime. And I'm here to teach you about this oppression. So the journalists today who are anti-lynching, which is police lynching, because lynching is getting away with murder. The journalists today who are anti-mass incarceration, which is the descendant of slavery, we don't believe there are two sides to these subjects. We believe that the masses have to be educated, and what we're doing is amplifying the voices to educate the masses who are 100% wrong. We're not going to debate this. We condemn lack of human rights, period.
Wow. That was beautiful. I mean, you speak the way I do when I'm being interviewed. Like don't be afraid to be energetic, man. I absolutely love that. The examples you chose were perfect as well. So I mean, I feel like we can probably close on that, but I just wanted to bring up like the fact that there were more journalists across the world killed last year than ever before. Do you believe, like, what do you think the solution, if there is any, to that? Because I mean, a lot of them are independent journalists, but some of them are not. I don't think this is this part of the question is like mainstream versus, MSM versus independent, like dichotomy. I think it's just like the work that journalists do is often incredibly dangerous, just like teachers or nurses, underappreciated. The value of telling a story is so critical because without us, no one would know what the hell was going on. And yet we don't have, like, we're not armed. Like if we're going into war with a camera, we're armed with that. So like, right. Who protects us?
That is a great question. And you're right, armed with a camera. That's my only weapon when I go out there. We're in a very scary time for journalism. We really, really are. We lack protections. Anytime you go against the state, whether it's locally, whether it is against police or the state militarily, you're at greatest risk. I mean, we know Julian Assange is in jail, and he should not be in jail. His WikiLeaks uncovered the collateral damage video, which many of us saw, which was literally American soldiers murdering 12 Iraqis, including 2 Reuters journalists. People don't even know that part about Reuters journalists that they murdered. And people don't even know the people who murdered them. Not only that, none of the people who murdered them in that video, and people could look it up, it's called collateral damage. None of them went to jail. The actual murderers didn't get to jail. His crime was exposing the military state. Okay. So what happens is when you're talking about Assange, him being locked up is a threat to all journalists. Okay. All journalists. That's what he was locked up for. Okay. If there was something else that he should be locked up for that people talk about, then try him on that. Because if there's say alleged a sexual assault violation, then have a trial. That's separate. But what he was locked up for was his journalism. And that is a threat to everyone. And what we can't do is say, well, I'm going to lock up the journalists I like, and I'm going to not lock up the journalists I don't like. We can't have that. And there are many more examples. But again, this goes back a long ways. This goes back to Vietnam, Daniel Ellsberg. This goes back to anyone who has uncovered state crimes.
Yeah, so you took it to a different place that's probably even more poignant. I mean, I don't think we can get around the violence around us as we do our jobs, but there's certainly, the state violence against journalists for truth telling is probably an issue that we could have more control over if more of us stand up for those like Assange. And it is more of an issue, I guess, too, because it is clearly freedom of speech is okay for some and not for others. Yeah, it's pretty frightening. Did you think Trump was going to pardon him?
I thought there was an outside chance because some of his people were asking for that.
Yeah.
I thought there was an outside chance, but You
Yeah.
know, it's not looking good. It's not looking good for journalists as a whole. They're using, 1917 laws that were made in a different time, and World War I sedition laws, and expanding it. And we see that over and over, whether it's use of the Patriot Act, whether it's use of various war laws. They use these laws and then they criminalize journalists. And then you have to be very careful when you look at legal language. So even a bulletin that came out for Joe Biden this week, which looks like it's against white extremism and white terrorism. If you look at the fine print, they'll say they are going after people who have anger over those who stole the election, those who fall under the category of white terrorists. And then there's fine print that says, and those who have anger over police use of force. So it's at the bottom there. It's snuck in there. And what that means is there could become a time the same extra pressures and regulations and expansion of policies that are to get to stop white terrorism. And we have a unique history in our country of white terrorism that is like no these other groups. Well, now you could use those same laws for those who are fighting police brutality, fighting police terror.
Yep. And we knew that was going to happen. It did happen. There's tons of leftists that no one's ever heard of who are in prison because of the Patriot Act. And, a lot of us said the same thing was going to happen as soon as they started talking about, tougher laws after January 6th. The smart ones, I think, said, there's nothing good about Nazis. And so if you make a law that is very specific to white terrorism, we can probably get behind that. But if you're going to keep it open-ended, so it's like anyone who does, something that could be considered a protest, like we're all in deep trouble. Yeah. So fingers crossed, I guess, is, it's not like we elected a real revolutionary. What are your thoughts to close it out on Biden and how having someone like this might compare the next 4 years to, a much more blatant racist, someone who talks about it like Trump?
I've been very critical of Biden in the future on his record of mass incarceration.
Yeah.
I'm going to, really 1980s, working with Strom Thurmond. I don't have hopes on Biden. I think step one was you get Trump out of office, stop that level of fascism, and that has been done. I don't have great hopes for him afterwards. Here's what I would love people to understand: fight locally. We saw the changes that have happened in policing. We fought locally, and that's how we changed that. So don't wait for Biden. Don't expect much from Biden. If Biden gives you anything, it's a bonus. But I know in Rochester yesterday, a 9-year-old girl was arrested and pepper sprayed by a gang of thugs called police officers, and that department needs to be shut down. So what I would like to see in Rochester is shut down that department and fight to shut that down, because that shouldn't happen. I know in Hamilton, police chief in Georgia was just caught on video extolling the virtues of good old days of slavery while spewing the N-word, and the chief is doing this to another officer. Well, they fired the chief right away and someone else, but that's not the problem. The problem is if you have a police chief who talks this way and as freely to another officer, the entire department is rotten to the core. Okay. And if there was a school that this happened in, or if there's a hospital that happened in, we shut down that school, we shut down that hospital. So we have to shut these places down. We don't need Joe Biden to do that. We don't stop waiting on Joe Biden. We have to get to work locally where we live to shut down this racism.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Chuck. I really appreciate it, man. Thank you for your time.
Appreciate you.
Yeah, man. Have a great day.
Okay, you too.
Peace.
Peace.